And welcome back, everyone, to Creators Corner here on the Tabletop Express. This is the show where we go behind the meeple, we meet the people, and I am excited tonight. This is the second episode that I've recorded live this week, and had a really great conversation last night that I'm going to encourage everyone to tune into. But tonight, I'm going to just say, excited to have Joseph Z. Chen here. You know Joseph in particular as a designer and artist behind Fantastic Factories. Welcome to the channel, Joseph.
Thank you. Yeah, it's great being here. Thank you for having me.
Well, you know, I ask everyone this question at the start, so this will be no different. What is your origin in board gaming in terms of the board game or board games that got you into the hobby at some point in your life?
I think it's going to be a pretty typical story. I think the year after college, I just had a bunch of roommates, and we started playing Catan, and really got into Settlers Catan. In fact, I remember there was a particular night that me and one of my roommates, we were playing, basically, instead of actually playing the game, we would set the board, and we would discuss the optimal placement of all the settlements for all four players. Like if I were trying to figure out the best place to place those settlements, I place it here. We play out that whole initial kind of setup, and then we would break it down and reset it up again and kind of discuss it again. So we wouldn't actually play the game. We just talk about initial placements. So you can see we kind of got really into it, and after Catan, we got into other games like Seven Wonders, Alien Frontiers, Race for the Galaxy, and you'll probably recognize a few parts of the DNA of how Fantastic Factories came about as well. But in general, it was like many other people through Settlers Catan.
Yeah, that's obviously that's been a big one, and with quite a few people I've spoken with. And I was actually going to ask you now, so I'll go right into it because you kind of mentioned it. What part of the playing of board games went into, that DNA of your own games that you go on to create, because obviously playing games can inspire with you ideas and maybe a way that you might do something, or you might like a simple mechanic. So how did that impact in particular when you went into the creation of Fantastic Factories?
Yeah, I think when I started designing, I think in terms of experience, I was still very kind of new to the hobby. I had played mostly kind of like the more classic mainstream hobby board games, that like the ones I mentioned, and went in kind of naively thinking, how do we make the perfect board game? And to be clear, such thing doesn't exist, right? But back then I was a bit, optimistic and naive about it, and I was like, I'll just glue together all of the different mechanics that I enjoyed from all these different games and throw it all in one game, and it's going to be a really good game, right? You cherry pick the good stuff, leave behind the bad stuff. Well, turns out gluing all that together is kind of challenging, and I would say when you're designing a game, and back then I wasn't thinking at all like I'm going to publish this game, I'm going to sell it in retail. And so for me, it was just like I just want to make a game that I would like to play. And so I started just by putting together those pieces.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Fantastic Factories has come out obviously as the base game, and you've got the expansions. What's your process, that you have developed for yourself early on here, from the creation perspective, from the gameplay to the art to the rule book, in terms of organizing how you're going to build this? What is your process at this point kind of become in terms of the order that you kind of take to do things and kind of go through that creative process?
Yeah, I think for me, I guess I'm in a unique position where I've kind of touched almost every piece of the every step of the way, from design, development, art direction, publishing, fulfillment, logistics. And I think, at least for Fantastic Factories, the base game, we started off with design, and just kind of figuring out where's the fun. So for me, designing a board game, the first step is figuring out what's fun. So oftentimes you kind of focus on one or two mechanics and try to test out the interaction. And for me, I guess as a designer, I'm more of a mechanics first designer, and some people are more theme first. And so the theme came secondary for me. And I actually originally had tried to theme it as a kind of like a space themed rocket game, but it didn't work out and kind of settled on factories. But from there, it was kind of factories are kind of boring, at least, from a theme perspective. How do I make this, a little more exciting? And a bit more background here, like I really enjoyed Race for the Galaxy, and it has really strong engine building mechanics that are really a lot of fun. But the biggest problem with that game was trying to get people to play the game. It's got kind of a steep learning curve. Usually the first game is kind of a throwaway game. And so from a kind of philosophical perspective, like, okay, how do I capture that same feeling, make that game approachable? So at that point, I was kind of putting on my kind of both publisher hat and like art direction hat. I was like, what are the key components to kind of bring this game, these mechanics, into like an approachable game? And I settled on kind of like this, the name of the game, Fantastic Factories, like high color, very colorful, simple vector arts that would also kind of suggest like the game is simple. It's easy to pick up, easy to learn. And so what's interesting is being able to be part of all of that process lets me interweave the design into the philosophy of the game, weave the art into that philosophy, as well as just the publishing aspect as well, deciding what components make sense. And it's kind of a more holistic approach to creating a game.
And it's very, I will say, and the game itself, I know if I was to look on Board Game Geek, I think it describes it in the sense of a light game, not a heavy game of it, certainly. Mm-hmm. But it's also bright. That stood out to me. Like it catches your eye at a table. It's bright. It evokes kind of that experience of, okay, it looks like, I guess I best describe it as a game. It looks like, if I play this, I feel like I'm going to get some joy from it. That was something that I immediately picked up on, because on the table, again, bright colors go a long way. When you think of the art side, because you obviously were involved with that component, do you wear a different hat when you get into that phase, or are you still thinking about kind of the big picture of all the other stuff? Because I know some people who've done both, who really, when they are in design mode, they're in design mode. When they're in the art mode, they're in the art mode. But you obviously having your hand in the pot for all these things, I can imagine you could go either direction with that.
Yeah, I think that the process for each does function quite differently. And there is a bit of like shifting gears. Like definitely there are, once I get into the art mode, like you start building a lot of momentum, and then shifting to like wearing a different hat. There's definitely a kind of like ramp down, ramp up kind of stage in order to build that momentum. And it's actually quite tough, I think, to move on like to the next project. There's actually quite a bit of time between like the base game and doing the expansion, because kind of taking off the Kickstarter publisher hat, picking back up the design hat that I had not really done in over a year at that time, like was kind of a mental challenge of like, how do I get back into this? But like while I'm doing art, am I thinking about mechanics? And I think that it doesn't necessarily tie in that deeply, but I'll put in a little Easter egg sometimes. Like I'll know this particular card, mechanic, in order to get the theme to match the mechanics. I know like the inputs are metal resources and the output is energy. So like I'll put in little almost Easter eggs of like, okay, this is a symbol for metal. You can see it feeding into the factory, and then you can see like electricity being generated on the other side under the factory in the art. As well as I know that the particular card requires you to place dice on the card, and so I'll like sometimes frame the art around those little slots on the card. And so that's kind of where being the artist and the graphic designer can help, because normally you would just commission the art, you put the art on the card, but like considering the details of the mechanics as well as how the card's laid out kind of gives me the advantage to like intertwine all of it together.
I like that. And you talk about the expansion. So I want to just ask you on the side of the expansion, what part in the process does that come in? Is the expansion something you have in mind, fairly early on, even during the base game? Is it something you wait on? Because an expansion has to do a few things. It has to be obviously something that you want to add in and continue to play. But expansions we've seen over the years do something that's either modular or it's something that you're always going to play with. So in your case, I believe when you came out, you gave a few more different ways to play. You added, variety, which each of the expansions. But what's your kind of concept there of when does this idea for the expansion come in, and how do you build it to really add the value to the game?
Yeah, so from the fairly close to the beginning, it's kind of a system that lends itself easily to expansion, right? So I think expansion was pretty early in early stages, an option that we wanted to leave open. And given the amount of content that we ended up cutting from the base game, just like cutting to pieces, trying to streamline the game, like there were things that didn't quite work mechanically well or potentially were too complex for what we wanted to be in the base game. A lot of those pieces that we trimmed off became natural candidates for expansion material. And but that by itself doesn't make an expansion. So what's interesting about designing expansion is that there really are a lot of different kinds of expansions. Like, what is the angle? What is the approach that you're trying to get to? Is it a more stuff kind of expansion? Is it add variety, or does it somehow transform the game into a different game? You're adding a very game-changing mechanic that makes the pieces all familiar, but the gameplay feel very different because of that transformative mechanic. And we spent a bit of time kind of playing around with ideas if there were ways we could transform the game a bit. Actually, to get into the details, one of the particular weak points of Fantastic Factories is it's not a particularly interactive game in the sense that players don't interact with each other in very meaningful ways. A lot of people describe it as like a multiplayer solitaire game, which is interesting because and this gets back to there's no such thing as a perfect game. Some people view that as a plus. Some people view that as a negative. And I, for a while, was trying to seek a way, like, how can we get this game to be more interactive and exploring different mechanics we could add. And at the same time, the tricky challenge is to consider our existing audience. We have a fan base that enjoyed playing this game, and they like the fact that they can focus on their own tableau without being disrupted by other players, and that's a huge bonus. And we wanted to continue to cater to that audience, as well as cater to audiences that are craving a bit more interaction, a bit more competition. And so what we ended up doing for the Kickstarter campaign is actually creating 2 expansions. One that was more focused around player interaction, another one that was focused more around additional content and adding a bit more variety and replayability to the game. And so those are kind of the 2 angles that we approached with the expansion.
I was wondering if that was part of it. So I'm really glad you shared that, because when you look at the 2 that you put out, which was Manufactions and Subterfuge, they really were very different in what they offered. So I found it, I was intrigued by that. And I love that too, because of the fact that you could take out one expansion for one group and another expansion for another group, and the value is going to be there. And they're going to have a great time. But I like the thing that one of the base things about this game was the ability to get to a table. It was fun. It was easy to learn. Talk about the teaching process or the process you go into thinking about a game with replayability. How do you think you design a game that that actually has that replayability, because a lot of games say replayable, but it's fair to say not all games actually accomplish that. I would argue, based on everything I have seen, yours does that. So be interested in your kind of philosophy on what makes something truly replayable.
Yeah, I think at the core of it is just multiple paths to victory, and then also forcing, to a certain extent, players to have to adapt their strategies. So like a lot of players, they'll gravitate towards one particular play style, right? And as a result, that can become stale because like, okay, I'm just gonna do this particular strategy and we do it every time. Like in Dominion, maybe you just like doing the big money strategy, and so that can grow stale if there aren't other strategies that are either situationally better, or there are ways that force you into having to pursue different strategies. And I think being primarily a card game really helps with that, because you have to play with the hand you're dealt. I know, like, there's a lot of figures of speech. It's like you play the hand you're dealt, and it's, I guess in this case, a very literal kind of analogy here, because there's a lot of different ways there's to appeal to also different audiences. So some players like to really build big boards, just like to build stuff over and over again, and some people like to have a really tight engine that they can run and repeat over and over again. And what was really helpful for this was I actually prefer the tight engine, but my co-designer, he likes building lots of stuff. And so there's always this kind of like two different perspectives, where he was representing one particular strategy, I was representing the other, and making sure both were kind of balanced and represented. That's not to say that those are the only strategies, but like those are kind of some of the more key archetypes. And another way of kind of making sure there was a variety here was that oftentimes, in order to win the game, you had to basically have a primary strategy as well as a secondary one in order to really make it across the finish line and secure that first place spot. So when you have to like dabble in like primary strategy and a secondary strategy in order to be successful, like that cross section of all those different strategies can really make for a very different gameplay each time. And
working with a co-designer, what was that experience like? In terms of, I imagine it's nice to have someone to bounce ideas off of outside of, say, playtesting. But how do you think that, what was it, first and foremost, what was that experience like, and how do you do that effectively? Because obviously two people working on something does mean there's going to be something that you may not agree on, obviously.
Yeah, and that's definitely the case. And a lot of people see that as a negative, but like it's also very much a positive, I think, especially if you're going to self-publish and go the Kickstarter route, like having a separate perspective, because I think people can get really like overly focused in on a design pet peeve that they like what we call like sacred cows. Like people have a particular mechanic or element of the game that they're just insistent that they need to put it in the game, to the detriment of the game. And having a co-designer can really help pull you out of that situation and say, like, you know what, give you perspective, like this particular interaction, this mechanic or this card or whatever it is just needs to go. It's just not doing what it needs to do for the game. And so that perspective is really valuable. But like you said, it does mean that you run into situations where you don't always agree. And I think luckily my co-designer, I didn't disagree on too many things. And part of that comes from building that early working relationship. We're really good friends. And originally actually it was my design, but he had been so helpful collaborating with it that it ended up being kind of both our designs in the end. So like being able to work well with him was kind of something that had developed from the very beginning. So I think that really helps.
And how important was it for you to have some kind of way to play this solo in the game? Because obviously there is a solo mode of sort. I have not, having not done the solo mode, I can't speak to it personally, but the fact that I do know it's there, I know is important to a lot of people. I've got a few people I know who have watched my particular channel, even come on the channel and just talked about solo gaming, and they genuinely will do that more than 50% of the time. So it's a critical piece for them.
Yeah. Actually, the solo game came later in design, actually much later. And I think it came from two different kind of motivating factors. There were, first of all, the game, as I mentioned, is fairly multiplayer solitaire. So in that sense, it made sense that it would be able to adapt a kind of a solo version of the game relatively easily without altering the core experience of the game. Secondarily, like going on Kickstarter, it seemed like it was quite a hot trend to release a solo game. And to be fair, to be accurate, like my intent wasn't to like just throw a solo game out there because that will increase the number of people back in the game. I wanted to make sure it was a good solo game, and ended up on what it was quite an elegant design, and basically the philosophy I had with the game design of the solo game was that the opponent, the AI that you were playing against, doesn't need to take exact actions as though they were a player. They just need to simulate the same effect. They should affect you in the same way, but you want to minimize the amount of like state management you have to do. So that's kind of how the solo game came about.
I do have a question. Brian is chiming in. Always good to see Brian. He says, "Hey, Joseph, how do you decide whether to apply your new ideas to an expansion or potentially, in this case, I guess, a new game?"
Expansion or new game? So I guess I could speak to like whether it's base game or expansion versus expansion and new game is an interesting one. Let me think about that for a moment, because for base game and expansion, to me, the difference with expansion is you have an invested audience. They already know your base game. They're familiar with mechanics. It gives you a little more freedom to kind of play around with additional complexity, right? Because they're building on top of a kind of base level of knowledge about your game. As opposed to for a new game, I suppose it's going to depend on whether that particular interaction or whatever content you're creating, whether it fits with like the main core fun of the game. So right. You don't want to like misrepresent your game. You don't want to change your game to something it isn't, right? So once you identify what I kind of call the soul of the game, you're going to make sure every piece of what you're putting in the game fits into that. And if it doesn't, then that might be content for a different kind of game.
Yeah, and I mean, really, when it comes down to it, obviously, you do need to think about that audience. You've had some success now with Kickstarter 2 times, and I will say congratulations to that. With this, I believe, too, it's worth noting as we're recording this on the Kickstarter, there is a pre-order now. It's still up there on the expansions. So if anyone's looking, they can still go pre-order that, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep, that's correct. The games are actually on the ocean right now, coming across. Finally got through. Ocean freight is like ridiculous right now, so it's a lot of delays.
How did you deal with the challenge? By the way, I'm intrigued by this because this is something that we're facing in the moment that we're recording this in June 2021. But there's delays like never. I don't want to say never before, but it just seems like delays everywhere you look, and it's happening for obvious reasons. So it's not easy though when you're trying to deliver on this to people, and some people are probably more understanding than others. So how has that been, and how have you kind of confronted the challenges that come with it?
Yeah, I've definitely seen a lot of Kickstarter campaigns that feel like they've kind of fallen off the rails, and like the backers are always complaining in the comments, and unfortunately, part of it is luck, part of it is, or perhaps more of it is about just transparency and communication. I think people are generally understanding of situations. You have to give it to them straight. You don't make false excuses or anything like that, and you just be as transparent as possible. Admit when if something was your fault, you admit that you made a mistake. And I think as long as you're transparent, people are very supportive. And I've seen situations where like someone will make kind of a disparaging remark, and then I'm lucky enough that our backers right now they'll actually answer other backers' questions. You know, um, if it's been addressed before in a previous update or things like that, or they'll kind of give us the benefit of the doubt, which is really encouraging. I know other communities aren't necessarily as welcoming, and so it's all very much about like what kind of community you want to cultivate, and a lot of that comes from just being transparent and honest when you deliver bad news about something happening with
Yeah,
the
and
timeline.
I would say too, 'cause that's I mean, just in my experience in life and in my years with marketing, I mean, a good community, that's what they do. So I mean, that's a tremendous testament to the work that you and your team have done, because I mean, really, when that's happening, you know you did it right. You know, before you go, I have a question I want to ask you, but I want to make sure I ask you a quick fun question or two. Um, what kind of games are you playing outside of your own? What kind of games are you playing these days? What's on the table, you know, recently for you?
Well, recently, because of the pandemic, probably not much. But actually, it's exciting. This Sunday, I'm finally going out to play some board games with some friends for the first time since the pandemic happened. But before that, like my preference for games are kind of like medium lightweight Euros or party games. So, in actually, once you start getting designing, you you end up playing 80% of the time you're playing other people's prototypes. And so, and the only time, for the most part, that I was playing published games was actually at conventions. But like some of the games I've really loved in the past are like Tiny Towns
Yep.
From AG, Floor Plan from Deep Art Games, which is like a roll and write about designing a blueprint for your dream house. I really like Skull. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that one. It's like
I have never played Skull. I'm familiar with it, but I will say Floor Plan that you mentioned, I've stared at in my local store for probably a good 6 months. It's sat there on the shelf, and I keep saying I think it needs a home. So I might have to jump on that one next time I'm in there.
Yeah, if you're like me and trying to buy a house, but it's next to impossible in this market, that's the next best thing. Plan your dream home.
Well, you're
Yeah.
you're out west in Seattle area, which I know is insane for that. So I send my best in that regard too, just because that's a challenge. And I'm in a tough market here in New Jersey, and we're lucky to have owned. But I digress. I digress back to kind of what you were saying. The thing that I want to actually ask too, outside of the kind of that world of games that you're in, what is it if there's something like you would say if someone was getting to know you, and like, you know, one of the things I always ask people just as a kind of an icebreaker, it's a lot of fun when it comes to it down to you're in a place that has some great food. What's the kind of great restaurant or food recommendation, you know, or that maybe you have in your general area, because you're in a fantastic game town. I would note from the people I've talked to, there's a lot of people out there who play board games, so it's a worthwhile area to visit too.
Yeah. The question is around food. Is that what you said?
Yeah, just like
Okay.
completely unorthodox, unrelated to gaming, because I think I like to say, I would like to joke, it's just great to get to know people, right? And because you're as part of a community, you're out in an area where I know there's a lot of people, and a lot of people have traveled. Like, just great. What's a kind of a favorite food or a favorite restaurant or something out your way that, you know, you would tell someone to go to if you wanted to go hang out and play like a small table game?
Yeah, it's funny because like also with the pandemic, haven't been out to actually sit down at any restaurants for a while, and the one that came to mind, unfortunately, also burned down.
Oh
So
no!
I had
Oh
a
no!
really good ramen place in my neighborhood called Aloha Ramen that unfortunately was a victim, I think, of arson, or at least some sort of shenanigans that burned down the whole strip of businesses. But
Okay.
I mean, aside from that, like there's a lot of great restaurants in like the Pike Place Market area. Like I really like Pierogi. There's these Russian pastries that are filled with like meat and cheese. Um, I'm trying to. It's crazy. It's been so long. Like I think the pandemic has just taken. There's so many like so much collateral damage. Like because
It
like
it's
Il
in,
Corvo is a great Italian restaurant for that was open only for lunch, but they ended up closing due to pandemic related things. And
well, it's we're talking about too. I mean, as you're part of an industry that got impacted by it as well.
mhm.
Maybe and it's interesting. And as we sit in this world, I think there's a lot we can be happy about and be reflect on and be just grateful for. And I'm really grateful to have got a chance to chat to you. One of the things I'm always grateful for on this show is the fact that people such as yourself can give great advice to those people who are talking in their minds and saying, "Hey, I would love to make a game, or I want to do a Kickstarter, or I want to be an artist on or an illustrator for a board game." What's the kind of advice that you give to those people who maybe want to break into this in some way or form, either as an artist or a designer?
Yeah, I would say the couple of pieces of advice I would give is first, think about like what you really want to accomplish. Like what is your end goal? Because um, people come into the industry for a lot of different reasons. They maybe want to work full time in it, or they maybe just want to see their creation get off the ground. And so I think understanding the motivations can really help frame how you get there. Um, in some cases, people are here to try to make some money. In which case, I say board games is kind of hard to make money in, um, because it's just not as large as say like the video game industry. Um, but figure out like what you want to do. So, like for designers, like figure out do you want to self publish? You know, do you want to pitch the game to the publishers? And because that can really alter how you go about approaching what you're doing. Um, do you want to be part of a project, a passion? Like, is it a passion project, or is it how many games do you want to be known for? Is it just one particular design that is your baby that you want to get out there? Like for me, I didn't, I wasn't looking to become a publisher, but I had a particular creative design that included, art, graphic design, and overall feel of the game. For me, it was about creative control, um, and getting the game into as many stores, as many hands as possible. And so, like for the Kickstarter, we didn't bling out the copies of the game. Like we made it friendly for retail because I know that's the best way to get it into as many hands as possible. And so, like understanding what your goal there is I think can be really helpful. And just because I'm really excited about this, I want to really show this, like in terms of like getting the game to as many hands as possible. My publishing partner, they're in charge of like doing foreign language licensing, and they sent me this recently. So it's
Oh, that's awesome.
a Chinese copy of Fantastic Factory. So it's really cool to see it like in different regions of the world. Um, and then the other piece of advice. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was gonna say that's got to be really cool to see that come to fruition. Of like I mean, I've seen it with offers before, but I often don't see that with the board games because I don't actually get to hold them in my hand. So that's just must be a really neat feeling to kind of have that in your hands.
Yeah, it's surreal. And I told him like, send me at least one copy of every language because I mean, it's gonna be a stock of games I'll never play, but it's cool to just have them in different languages. And so like that's what I'm motivated by. And so figure out your motivation. And the other piece I've kind of alluded to already, like having someone, if you're gonna go down the design or publishing route, like having a partner in that journey, I think can really help. Because I think one of the biggest things that um, can that really make a difference in whether you're going to get traction in the market or not is kind of getting that extra perspective. Like, is this theme really a theme that is going to appeal to a wide enough audience for what your goal is, and having that second opinion, someone who is has as much at stake as you do, they're going to be willing to say like, this is a bad idea. When you ask your friends, family, your playtesting game, they'll smile and they say, okay, that was fun, but it's your co-designer or co-publisher or whoever. They're going to be the ones who are going to kind of face the facts and say like, this is not good enough, or this needs to change. And having that partner, I think, is kind of a huge difference maker in the process.
Yeah, and I think that that person is going to be honest with you. Sometimes is a rarity, and so when you can get them by your side, so helpful. I really think the advice you just gave incredibly helpful for those listening. So I thank you for that. I want to say thank you, of course, to you for taking time to chat with me tonight. Really enjoyed getting your perspective and really hearing about kind of that creation process, because I think that's always just fascinating and everyone does it different, but you really touch every aspect of it. So it's a unique approach, and I thank you for sharing that. So thanks for your time tonight.
Yeah, no, once again, thank you for having me. It was a pleasure talking to you.
And before you go, I just want to let everyone know, please, please, please stay tuned, because next week I'm going to have the fine folks from Storm Chaser Games joining me here for Creators Corner. Same time, I believe, at 8:30. If not 9 o'clock, I'll confirm that. But that's already up on the YouTube, so you can go over there, like, subscribe if you like what you see, or you've got a creator that you think should be here on Creators Corner. Please message me about that too. My biggest thing that I want to do here is tell the stories of creators, designers, illustrators, and really give us all a chance to meet them and get to know them. So that's what I'm trying to do here. And if you can help me with that journey, that'd be great. I look forward to more great conversations as the summer goes on. Thank you again to my guest, Joseph, for joining me. And I will hope that I see you all next week. Again, that's Thursday night. We should be back here for another episode of Creators Corner. Have a great night, everybody.